Hello, midnight wanderers, and welcome to the Void Scribe. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I've always enjoyed late-night fishing. There's something peaceful about being near the water when the rest of the world is asleep. The quiet, the darkness, and the feeling of having an entire place to yourself can be relaxing in a way that's hard to explain. But after what happened one night with my boyfriend, I haven't looked at those quiet fishing trips the same way since. At the time, I was working evening shifts at Taco Bell. One particular night, I finished work around 11 p.m. My boyfriend and I had already planned earlier that day to go fishing after my shift. When the time finally came, though, I was completely exhausted. My feet hurt, my eyes felt heavy, and all I wanted to do was go home and collapse into bed. I remember sitting in the parking lot after clocking out and seriously considering canceling our plans. The idea of standing near a river in the middle of the night sounded far less appealing than it had that morning. My boyfriend, however, was excited about it. We already planned it, he told me, just for a little while. After a few minutes of convincing, I agreed. At the time, I thought the worst thing that could happen was that I'd be tired at work the next day. I had no idea how strange the night would become. The spot we planned to visit was one we had discovered the previous evening. It was a quiet boat launch area near a river, tucked away from the busier parts of town. What made the location especially interesting was that it sat near an old battleship, permanently docked nearby. The ship had a reputation in the area. Locals often talked about ghost stories connected to it. It had served during both the Vietnam War and the Cold War, and over the years, plenty of rumors had developed around it. Supposedly, people had heard footsteps aboard when nobody was there, seen strange lights, or experienced unexplained feelings while visiting. Neither of us really believed those stories, at least not at the time. When we arrived, we fished for around 20 minutes before realizing we had a problem. It was far darker than we expected. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the area had almost no lighting. The water, docks, and surrounding trees blended together into one massive black void. Eventually, we decided to make a quick trip to Meyer before it closed at midnight so we could buy a headlamp. The drive there was uneventful. We joked around, grabbed the light, and headed back. Everything still felt normal. Once we returned, the headlamp made fishing much easier. We spent the next hour moving between different docks and casting into the dark water. The river was calm, the air was cool. Besides the occasional splash of a fish and the distant sounds of insects, everything seemed completely peaceful. Then we noticed flashing police lights across the river. There was another boat launch on the opposite side, and several police vehicles appeared to be gathered there. We watched them for a minute. Neither of us thought much of it. Maybe someone had parked after hours. Maybe officers were checking on people hanging around too late. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like our business. After a while, the lights disappeared, and things returned to normal. Or at least that's what we thought. Roughly 15 minutes later, a scream echoed through the darkness. The sound carried across the water so clearly that both of us immediately froze. It sounded like someone shouting something along the lines of "forget everyone," though we couldn't be completely certain. The voice seemed angry, not frightened, just angry. We looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" I asked. My boyfriend nodded. We waited. Nothing followed. After a few moments, we laughed nervously and convinced ourselves it was probably some teenager messing around nearby. It wasn't the first time we'd encountered strange people while fishing. So we kept fishing. But then we heard another scream, and another, and another. The voice seemed to be coming from the same general area where the police had been earlier. This time, however, the words sounded different. Now it sounded like someone yelling for help. The first scream had been unsettling. The repeated cries were much worse. For the next 2 hours, we continued hearing them off and on. The voice would disappear for several minutes, then suddenly return. Every time it happened, my stomach tightened. I tried to tell myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was drunk. Maybe a group of people were playing around. Maybe the sound was traveling strangely across the water. But deep down, something felt wrong. The screams sounded too genuine, too desperate. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. My boyfriend had work at 6 in the morning, and it was already incredibly late. Most people would have gone home. Unfortunately, we made a different decision. We decided to investigate. Looking back, it was probably one of the dumbest choices we've ever made. We convinced ourselves that if someone truly needed help, we'd never forgive ourselves for ignoring it. So we packed up our fishing gear and headed toward the other boat launch. A toll bridge separated the two areas. Crossing it felt strange. The further we drove, the more isolated everything became. Streetlights disappeared. Buildings vanished. Soon it was just our truck, a narrow road, and darkness stretching in every direction. The headlights illuminated only a small section of pavement ahead of us. Everything beyond that remained hidden. Tall grass lined both sides of the road, swaying slightly in the night breeze. The atmosphere felt completely different from where we'd been fishing. I couldn't explain why. Nothing looked unusual. Yet I suddenly felt nervous. The kind of nervousness that appears for no reason. The kind that tells you something isn't right. Neither of us spoke much. The truck rolled forward slowly. As we approached the water, I suddenly noticed something standing ahead. At first I thought it was a sign. Then I realized it was moving. My heart nearly stopped. There was a person standing directly in the middle of the road. I immediately started trying to get my boyfriend's attention. Look ahead. He squinted through the windshield. Then he saw it too. As we got closer, the figure became visible. It was an elderly woman. At least she appeared to be. She looked somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. Her gray hair hung down around her shoulders in thin, uneven strands. Her posture was unnaturally hunched forward, making her seem much older than she probably was. At first, I felt relieved. Maybe this was the person who needed help. Maybe she'd gotten lost. Maybe she suffered from dementia. Those explanations made sense. But then we got closer, and something about her appearance felt wrong. Not supernatural, just wrong. Her expression seemed strangely vacant. Her mouth hung slightly open. Her eyes stared forward without blinking. The closest comparison I can make is that she reminded me of a horror movie character trying to imitate a normal person. Almost human, but not quite. As our truck approached, she didn't move out of the road. She simply stood there, watching us. I remember feeling every hair on my arms stand up. My boyfriend slowed slightly. The driver's window was partially open. We passed within a short distance of her. Then, everything happened at once. The woman suddenly lunged toward the truck. Not by taking a step, not by reaching casually. She threw her entire upper body toward us. Her eyes widened dramatically. Her jaw opened farther than seemed natural. For a split second, her face transformed from confused to intensely aggressive. I screamed. My boyfriend hit the gas. The truck surged forward. Neither of us looked back immediately. We just wanted distance. As soon as we reached a nearby roundabout, my boyfriend turned around and accelerated away from the area. The speedometer climbed rapidly. 40, 45, 50 miles per hour. The entire drive, my heart pounded so hard it hurt. Neither of us understood what we'd just seen. An elderly woman standing alone in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning was strange enough. Her reaction when we passed her made it even stranger. We eventually stopped several blocks away, far enough that we felt safe, close enough that emergency responders could still find the location. I immediately called emergency services. Trying to explain the situation was surprisingly difficult. The dispatcher kept asking questions. I kept trying to answer while shaking uncontrollably. I explained the screaming, the isolated location, the elderly woman, her strange behavior, the fact that she might be lost, injured, intoxicated, or suffering from some kind of medical condition. Eventually, officers agreed to investigate. While waiting, we encountered a police officer. After a brief conversation, he revealed something unexpected. They had already responded to the same location earlier that night, the exact same location, for similar reports. That information made my stomach drop. It meant we weren't the only people hearing things. We weren't imagining it. Something had already drawn police attention before we ever arrived. After speaking with the officers, we finally decided to go home. The entire drive back felt surreal. Neither of us could stop replaying the image of that woman in our heads. Once home, curiosity got the better of us. We turned on the local police scanner and listened. For a while, officers searched the area. According to the radio traffic, they couldn't find anyone. No woman, no injured person, no source of the screams. Nothing. At one point they suggested it might have been an animal. Normally, I would have accepted that explanation. Except I'd grown up hearing animals in Michigan. Coyotes weren't unusual. Foxes sometimes made terrifying sounds too. And earlier that night, we had actually heard coyotes. The screams we heard were completely different. They sounded human, distinctly human. About 30 minutes later, another report came through the scanner. A nearby business had called authorities. Employees there had heard screaming coming from the woods near the same boat launch. Again, multiple witnesses. Same location. Same strange sounds. Yet officers still couldn't locate anyone. The search eventually ended without answers. No missing person. No injured woman. No explanation. Just questions. By then it was very late. We tried convincing ourselves everything had a logical explanation. Maybe the woman had wandered away before police arrived. Maybe someone had been playing a prank. Maybe there were details we simply didn't know. Those explanations helped a little. Not much, but enough to get us through the drive. When we finally reached our neighborhood, I thought the strange part of the night was over. I was wrong. As we parked on the street in front of our house, something caught my eye. Across the road stood a large yellow dog. At first it seemed completely normal. Dogs get loose all the time. It was probably somebody's pet wandering around. The animal stood partially hidden behind a tree, watching us. I didn't think much of it. My boyfriend and I got out of the truck and began walking toward our front door. The dog stepped out from behind the tree. Slowly, silently, it crossed the street, then stopped directly in the middle of the road and stared, not barking, not moving, just staring. I remember turning around once before going inside. The dog was still there, watching. Its silhouette remained perfectly still beneath the dim streetlights. Eventually, we entered the house and locked the door behind us. Neither of us slept particularly well that night. Even now, I still don't know what we experienced. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe the screaming came from someone hidden in the woods. Maybe the elderly woman was suffering from a medical condition. Maybe the dog was simply curious. Every individual piece of the story can be explained on its own. What bothers me is how all of it happened together. The screaming, the police responses, the mysterious woman, the empty search results, the second report from the nearby business, and finally, the silent dog watching us at nearly 3 in the morning. When I think back on that night, I don't necessarily believe anything paranormal happened, but I do believe we crossed paths with something we never fully understood. To this day, whenever I hear stories about strange encounters near isolated roads or deserted boat launches, I remember that woman standing in the middle of the darkness. I remember her widening eyes. I remember the way she suddenly lunged toward our truck. Most of all, I remember the feeling that settled over me in that moment, a deep instinct that told me to leave immediately. Whatever was happening out there that night, whether it was completely explainable or something far stranger, I'm grateful we trusted that feeling and drove away, because some mysteries are unsettling enough without ever learning the answer. One of the strangest memories from my childhood happened when I was about 5 years old. Even though I was very young at the time, I still remember that night surprisingly well. Most memories from that age have become blurry over the years, but this particular experience has always stayed with me because of how unusual it was. What makes it even stranger is that years later, when I finally talked to my siblings about it, they described seeing the exact same thing without me ever telling them what I had witnessed. At the time, my family was living in a fairly ordinary house. Nothing about the place seemed unusual. It wasn't old, abandoned, or known for anything strange. To anyone visiting, it would have looked like a completely normal family home. One night, I was lying on a mattress on the floor in my brother's room. My brother was already asleep beside me, and the rest of my siblings had gone to bed as well. The house was quiet except for the occasional sounds that every house makes at night, the distant hum of appliances, the creak of the floorboards settling, and the muffled noises coming from other rooms. The only person still awake besides me was my mom. She was in the bathroom brushing her teeth before bed. I remember waiting for her because I didn't want to fall asleep until she came back. At 5 years old, I always felt safer knowing my mom was nearby, so I just lay there on the mattress staring around the dark room while waiting for her. That's when I noticed something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Near the doorway, I saw what looked like a peach-colored blur. The strange thing was that I had seen this blur before. It wasn't the first time. Throughout my childhood, I occasionally caught glimpses of something peach-colored, moving incredibly fast through the house. Whenever I saw it, it never stayed in one place long enough for me to get a good look. It would flash past a doorway, race across a hallway, disappear around a corner. The movement was always so fast that it looked more like a streak of color than an actual person. Because of how quickly it moved, I never got a clear view of it. I would only catch brief glimpses before it vanished. Over time, I had almost become used to seeing it. As strange as that sounds, it had happened enough that I simply accepted it as something I occasionally noticed. But that night was different. For the first time ever, the peach-colored figure stopped moving. It stood completely still. The moment I realized it wasn't rushing past like usual, a shock ran through my body. I sat up slightly and stared. Because I was only 5 years old, my first thought was that it must be my mom. The figure was roughly human-shaped, and in my young mind, that was the only explanation that made sense. I remember feeling relieved for a moment. Maybe she had finished brushing her teeth and was checking on us. Maybe she was standing in the doorway before coming into the room. But then something happened that immediately made me uncomfortable. The figure turned and looked directly at me. I froze. Even as a child, I knew something wasn't right. The figure didn't move like a normal person. It didn't react the way my mom would have. It simply stood there staring at me. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it shot away. The movement happened so quickly that it almost didn't seem real. One moment it was standing still. The next, it had flashed out of the room and disappeared toward the living room. The speed was impossible. It didn't look like running. It looked more like a streak of color instantly crossing the house. I remember immediately getting off the mattress. At that age, curiosity often overpowered fear. I wanted to know where my mom had gone. So I climbed off the bed and followed after it. As I walked toward the living room, I called out for my mom. I expected her to answer from nearby. Instead, there was silence. When I reached the living room, nobody was there. The room was completely empty. I looked around, confused. The figure had disappeared. There was nowhere it could have gone. I had followed it almost immediately, yet there wasn't a single person in sight. For several moments, I stood there trying to understand what had happened. Then I heard my mom's voice. It wasn't coming from the living room. It was coming from the bathroom, exactly where she had been the entire time. The realization sent a strange feeling through me. If my mom was still brushing her teeth, then who or what had been standing in the doorway? I didn't have an answer. At 5 years old, I didn't even know how to process what I had seen. Eventually, I returned to the room and tried to forget about it. But the memory never completely left me. Years passed. As I grew older, I thought about that night from time to time. Part of me wondered whether it had simply been a childhood imagination. Children often misinterpret shadows and movements. Maybe I had been tired. Maybe my mind had filled in details that weren't really there. Those explanations seemed reasonable. Then one day, many years later, the subject came up while talking with my siblings. The conversation wasn't even about ghosts or strange experiences. It just somehow drifted toward unusual things we remembered from childhood. That's when one of my siblings mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. They started talking about a strange peach-colored figure they used to see around the house. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't mentioned my experience. I hadn't described what I saw. Yet they were talking about the exact same thing. I listened carefully as they described it. According to them, they would occasionally see a peach-colored blur flashing through hallways and rooms. It moved incredibly fast. It never stayed still, and it would disappear before they could get a proper look at it. I sat there in complete shock. Before I could even ask them for details, they were already describing everything I remembered. The speed, the color, the way it seemed to flash from one location to another. Every detail matched. As the conversation continued, they revealed something even stranger. Apparently, several of them had seen it over the years. Not just once, multiple times. Each person had assumed nobody else would believe them, so they rarely talked about it. Hearing that made the memory of my own experience feel much more real. For years, I had assumed it might have been my imagination. Now, I wasn't so sure. Eventually, the conversation turned toward what the figure actually looked like. Unlike me, some of my siblings claimed they had seen it more clearly. Their descriptions were unsettling. According to them, the figure appeared to be wearing a peach-colored dress. Its long hair extended down to its waist, possibly even longer. The face was the most disturbing part. They described deep, bloody-looking cracks across its features. And despite seeing different glimpses of it over the years, they all seemed to remember the same details. The peach dress, the long hair, the damaged face, the impossible speed. Listening to them sent chills down my spine, not because I believed it was necessarily something supernatural, but because they were describing something I had never told them about. The more we talked, the more similarities emerged. Every one of us had assumed we were alone in seeing it. Every one of us thought it was probably our imagination. Yet somehow, our stories matched. To this day, I don't know what to think about it. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe our childhood memories influenced one another without us realizing it. Maybe there was something about the lighting in the house that created strange illusions. Or maybe it was simply one of those mysteries that can never be fully explained. What I do know is that I can still picture that night clearly. I remember lying on my brother's mattress while the rest of the house slept. I remember waiting for my mom to finish brushing her teeth. I remember seeing the peach-colored figure standing completely still for the first time. And I remember the moment it looked directly at me before flashing away into the darkness. What unsettles me most isn't the memory itself. It's the fact that years later, without any prompting, my siblings described the exact same figure, the same color, the same speed, the same appearance, the same strange presence that seemed to move through our house without explanation. Even now, whenever the topic comes up, none of us can fully explain what we saw. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary answer hidden somewhere in our childhood memories. Or maybe some experiences remain mysteries no matter how much time passes. Either way, that peach-colored figure remains one of the strangest things any of us remember from growing up. And it is a memory that none of us have ever been able to forget. This story isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and honestly, I wouldn't even describe it as terrifying. What makes it memorable is how strange it was. Even years later, I still think about it from time to time, because I have never been able to come up with a satisfying explanation. The fact that several other people witnessed the same thing only makes it harder to dismiss. To this day, my friends and I still remember it clearly. The whole thing started when I was around 8 or 9 years old. Back then, both of my parents worked after school hours, so instead of going straight home after classes, I attended an after-school club. It was basically a place where kids could stay until their parents finished work. We would do activities, play games, finish homework, and spend time outside until it was time to be picked up. Most days were completely normal. This particular evening was different. It was winter, which meant darkness arrived much earlier than usual. Even though it was probably only around 5 or 6 in the evening, the sky was already pitch black. The playground lights illuminated parts of the school grounds, but beyond those pools of light, everything seemed darker than normal. That evening, I was hanging out with 3 of my closest friends. Like most kids our age, we had managed to scare ourselves. We had spent the last hour talking about horror movies, ghost stories, monsters, and every creepy thing we could think of. Looking back, we were probably feeding off each other's imagination. Every strange noise seemed suspicious. Every shadow looked unusual. We were standing in the large playground area near the school building when one of my friends suddenly stopped talking. Her face changed completely. She was staring toward the gymnasium. "Guys," she said nervously, "do you see that?" Immediately, all of us turned to look. At first, I didn't notice anything. Then I saw it. Through the enormous windows of the school's gym hall, a dark figure was moving across the room. I still remember how unusual it looked. It wasn't solid black like a shadow. It looked almost oily. As strange as that sounds, that's the best way I can describe it. The figure seemed darker than everything around it, almost like a silhouette made from liquid darkness. It appeared to be the shape of a tall man, not incredibly detailed, not close enough to identify, but definitely human-shaped. The strange thing was that it was moving through the brightly lit gymnasium. The lights inside were on. The room wasn't dark, and because of the massive windows surrounding the hall, we had a clear view inside. Our school was very old. It had been built around the same era as the Titanic, and the architecture reflected that. Large windows lined much of the building, especially around the gym hall. At that moment, there was still a janitor working inside the school. We could actually see her on the second floor through another set of windows, so we knew there was at least one adult in the building. But this figure wasn't the janitor. It wasn't moving like a normal person. And there didn't appear to be anyone else inside the gym. For several seconds, all four of us stood there staring. Nobody spoke, nobody laughed, nobody suggested it was a prank. We were simply trying to understand what we were seeing. The figure continued moving. Its movements seemed smooth, but somehow unnatural, not robotic, not ghostly, just odd, like it wasn't moving the way a normal person should. Of course, being curious children, we immediately made the worst possible decision. Instead of staying where we were, we decided to get closer. At the time, it seemed like a brilliant idea. Now, looking back, I realize how ridiculous it was. Four kids who had spent an hour frightening themselves with ghost stories decided the smartest thing to do was investigate a mysterious dark figure. So we started walking toward the gym hall, slowly at first, then a little faster. The closer we got, the more excited and nervous we became. I remember constantly glancing at the windows, afraid I would lose sight of it. Eventually, the figure reached a section between two of the large windows. Then it vanished, just like that. One moment it was there, the next moment it wasn't. There was no obvious place for it to go, no doorway nearby, no visible exit. It simply disappeared between the windows. All four of us stopped. "What was that?" someone asked. Nobody had an answer. We stood there trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had been a reflection. Maybe someone had walked out of view. Maybe there was an explanation we weren't seeing. As we discussed it, something else happened. Something that made the entire situation feel much stranger. The gymnasium doors slowly opened. Not all the way, just a crack. The movement was subtle, but noticeable. Every one of us saw it. At almost the exact same time, the lights inside the gym flickered. Not once, not a quick blink. They flickered repeatedly. The room brightened and darkened several times in rapid succession. Then everything returned to normal. I remember every one of us staring at the door in complete silence. The excitement we had felt moments earlier was suddenly replaced with nervousness. None of us wanted to get any closer. Eventually, we backed away and returned to the playground. The strange encounter became the main topic of conversation for weeks afterward. We talked about it constantly, trying to explain it, trying to recreate what we had seen, trying to figure out whether there was a logical explanation. Eventually, we gave it a name. The Black Blur. The name came from its appearance. It wasn't completely solid. It wasn't transparent. It looked like a dark blur moving through the building. The name stuck. For the next year or two, it became one of those stories we would occasionally bring up whenever we were together. Most people probably expected us to eventually forget about it. We didn't. The memory remained surprisingly clear. Then, something happened that made the story much harder to dismiss. Around a year or two later, I was again at the after-school club. This time, only one of the friends from the original encounter was with me. Like before, it was evening. The sun had already set. The school grounds were mostly quiet. We were standing near one of the school's entrances, talking about random things. One of the double doors was being held open by several trash bags the janitor had left nearby. For some reason, we started joking about how the arrangement looked like a vampire curled up in the doorway. It was exactly the kind of pointless conversation bored kids have when they're trying to entertain themselves. Then I noticed movement. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But this time was different. Much different. About 10 to 15 meters away, I saw the black blur again. And this time it was clearer than ever. I froze instantly. The sight shocked me so much that I couldn't even speak. I simply stood there, staring. The figure was moving back and forth across the open doorway. Again and again. Right, left, back and forth, almost like it was pacing or running. The movement was incredibly fast, yet unlike the first encounter, it remained visible long enough for me to observe it properly. This wasn't a split-second glimpse. This lasted for around 20 seconds, long enough that I had absolutely no doubt I was seeing something. The figure wasn't detailed. I couldn't make out facial features, but the same oily black appearance was unmistakable. The same strange movement, the same unnatural silhouette. As I stood there staring, my friend noticed my reaction. He followed my line of sight. A few seconds later, he spoke. "Hey, do you see that?" The question immediately sent a chill down my spine, because it confirmed I wasn't the only one seeing it. I nodded. Neither of us took our eyes off the doorway. For roughly 20 seconds, we watched the figure move back and forth, again and again. It never left the doorway. It never approached us. It simply continued its strange movement. Then curiosity got the better of us. Again, slowly, we began moving closer. Neither of us spoke much. We just kept watching. The closer we got, the more focused we became. And just like before, the moment we approached, it disappeared. Gone. No sound. No explanation. No visible destination. 1 second it was there. The next it wasn't. We reached the doorway and looked everywhere. Nothing, no person, no shadow, no object that could have created the illusion. Nothing. The encounter ended exactly the same way the first one had. With questions. Lots of questions. Years have passed since then. I've long since left that school behind. The after-school club is just a memory now. Most of the teachers have probably retired. Many of the students have moved away. Life moved on. But the black blur remains one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. What makes it difficult to dismiss is the number of witnesses. The first encounter involved 4 people. The second involved 2. Every person who saw it remembers it. Even now, if the subject comes up, we all describe essentially the same thing. The same dark silhouette, the same unusual movement, the same feeling that we were looking at something we couldn't identify. Over the years, I've considered countless explanations. Reflections in the glass, strange lighting conditions, shadows from people moving elsewhere in the building, optical illusions, even childhood imagination amplified by spooky conversations. Any one of those explanations might account for part of what happened, but none of them fully explain both encounters. Especially the second one, where 2 of us watched the same thing moving repeatedly for nearly 20 seconds. I still don't know what it was. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation that we've overlooked all these years. Maybe the answer is something incredibly simple. Or maybe it will remain one of those mysteries that never gets solved. What I find funny is that despite how strange the experience was, I don't really feel scared when I think about it. Mostly, I feel curious. If anything, I would love the opportunity to see it again. Not because I think it was something supernatural, but because after all these years, I still want answers. And considering I can still see my old school from where I live, who knows? Maybe one day I'll look out toward those old windows again and catch a glimpse of the black blur moving through the darkness one last time. Until then, it's a mystery that has followed me from childhood into adulthood, remaining just as strange today as it was the first time 4 curious kids spotted a dark silhouette walking through a brightly lit gymnasium on a cold winter evening. One of the strangest memories from my childhood happened when I was around 5 or 6 years old. Even now, years later, I still think about it from time to time. I've gone back and forth in my mind trying to figure out what actually happened that night. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was a dream that blended with reality. Or maybe it was something I'll never fully understand. Whatever the explanation is, I remember the experience so clearly that it has stayed with me ever since. At the time, I lived with my family in a fairly ordinary house. It wasn't old or known for anything unusual. It was a typical two-story family home with long hallways, several bedrooms, and a comfortable living room where everyone would gather in the evenings. One night, my entire family was sitting together in the living room. We were watching television, talking, and relaxing before bed. I was still young enough to fall asleep almost anywhere, and at some point during the evening, I drifted off while lying on the couch. I don't remember exactly what we were watching or what time it was. I just remember feeling warm and comfortable. The next thing I knew, I woke up. At first I was confused. The television was off, the room was silent, and I was completely alone. Everyone had gone to bed. The only source of light in the room was a lamp near the television. It cast a soft yellow glow across part of the living room, leaving the rest of the house covered in shadows. For a few moments, I simply sat there trying to understand what was happening. When you're 5 or 6 years old, waking up unexpectedly in an empty room can be surprisingly disorienting. I remember clutching my teddy bear tightly and wondering where everyone had gone. In my sleepy state, I wasn't scared yet. Mostly, I was confused. I climbed off the couch and began wandering through the house looking for someone. The silence felt strange. During the day, the house was always full of noise, people talking, doors opening and closing, television sounds and footsteps. Now everything was quiet. Almost too quiet. I walked through the hallway toward the kitchen area. I remember feeling thirsty, so I grabbed a small cup and started pouring myself some water. Because I was still half asleep, I spilled a little while filling it. That's when I noticed movement. Out of the corner of my eye, something rushed past me. It happened quickly, just a dark blur crossing my field of vision. My first thought was that one of my older brothers had gotten up for a drink too. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. Without even thinking, I called out to it. "Where's Mama?" My voice echoed slightly in the quiet house. No answer came. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then, I looked toward the hallway where I thought the figure had gone. Nobody was there. The hallway was completely empty. I frowned. I distinctly remembered seeing something move. Yet there wasn't anyone in sight. A strange feeling began creeping into my stomach. I slowly stopped pouring my water and set the cup down. The confusion I had felt moments earlier was beginning to turn into nervousness. I stood there listening. Nothing. The house remained silent. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I started walking toward the hallway. At that age, I wasn't thinking about danger or anything supernatural. I simply wanted to find whoever had run past me. Maybe they had gone into one of the bedrooms. Maybe I had missed them somehow. As I moved through the hallway, I approached my older sister's room. Her door was open slightly. The room beyond was almost completely dark. Unlike me, my sister didn't sleep with any kind of nightlight. Her room was usually pitch black at night. I remember peeking inside. And that's when everything changed. Standing, or rather hovering, over my sister's bed was a figure. At first, my brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. The figure was enormous, much taller than any normal person. Its body appeared completely black. Not dark because of shadows, actually black, as though it absorbed all the light around it. The only feature I could make out clearly were its eyes, bright white eyes staring downward. The figure appeared to be hovering above the floor beside my sister's bed. I froze instantly, every muscle in my body locked up. The feeling that hit me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Pure fear. the kind that completely takes over your body. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I simply stared. For a moment, the figure remained focused on my sister. Then it noticed me. Slowly, it turned its head. I remember hearing a cracking sound. Not loud, but enough to make me feel sick. The movement seemed unnatural, almost as though its neck shouldn't have been able to move that way. The second its white eyes met mine, my heart started pounding. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't do either. The figure stared at me for several seconds. Then it began moving. It drifted away from my sister's bed and toward the doorway. Toward me. I remember thinking there had to be another explanation. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the darkness was creating strange shapes. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. I desperately wanted any explanation, but the figure continued approaching. The closer it got, the more terrified I became. Its movements didn't resemble walking. Its feet never seemed to touch the ground. Instead, it glided silently across the room. The distance between us grew smaller and smaller. I stood frozen in place, clutching my teddy bear. My eyes filled with tears, yet somehow I still couldn't cry. It felt as though my body had completely shut down. Eventually, the figure reached me. It stopped directly in front of me, towering over me, looking down at me. I remember tilting my head back just to look at it. Then something happened that still disturbs me when I think about it. The figure tilted its head. At first, the movement seemed normal. Then it continued, and continued, and continued. Its head rotated far beyond what should have been possible. The motion seemed almost complete, as though it could turn all the way around. I don't know if it was actually 360 degrees, or if it simply felt that way in the moment. All I know is that the movement looked impossible. I remember feeling tears running down my face. But still, I couldn't make a sound. The figure remained there staring at me, the white eyes never blinking, never looking away. Then suddenly, something else happened. I heard footsteps behind me. My older brother had woken up. He had come out to get a drink of water. As he approached, he noticed me standing motionless in the hallway. From his perspective, I was simply staring upward at the doorway. He couldn't see anything unusual. No figure, no glowing eyes, nothing, just me, frozen in place. He called my name. I turned to look at him. For the first time since seeing the figure, my attention broke. I looked away, only for a second. Then I immediately looked back. The figure was gone, completely gone. The hallway was empty. The doorway was empty. My sister's room looked exactly as it always did. For a few moments, I just stood there, trying to process what had happened. My brother walked over and asked what was wrong. The moment he reached me, it felt like a spell had broken. All the fear I had been holding in suddenly exploded out of me. I started crying uncontrollably, not just tearing up, full panic, the kind of crying that makes it difficult to breathe. My brother immediately became concerned. He picked me up and carried me back toward our parents' room. The commotion woke everyone else up. Within minutes, both of my parents were awake and trying to calm me down. I tried explaining what I had seen, but I was so upset that I could barely get the words out. Eventually, my parents let me sleep in their room for the rest of the night. I don't remember much after that, only that I felt safe again once I was with them. The next morning, everything seemed normal. My sister was fine. The hallway looked ordinary. The house felt exactly the way it always had, and perhaps strangest of all, I never experienced anything like it again. Not in that house, not anywhere else. Years have passed since that night. I've grown older and spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. Maybe it was a vivid dream that blended into reality after waking up. Maybe I experienced a hypnopompic hallucination. which can happen when a person is transitioning from sleep to wakefulness. Maybe my young mind interpreted shadows and darkness in a way that seemed terrifying at the time. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably more likely than anything supernatural. But even knowing that, the memory still feels incredibly real. I can still picture the dark figure. I can still remember those white eyes. I can still recall the feeling of being completely frozen with fear while standing in that hallway holding my teddy bear. When people ask what I think happened, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that if I were really 5 or 6 years old again, I probably would have reacted exactly the same way. At that age, I don't think anyone would have been brave enough to investigate further. I certainly wasn't. The only thing I wanted was for someone to pick me up, tell me everything was okay, and make the scary thing disappear. And thankfully, whether it was real, imagined, or somewhere in between, that's exactly what happened. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I had an experience that, even though it wasn't supernatural, remains one of the scariest moments of my childhood. Looking back, I think what made it so frightening was the fact that it was completely real. There were no ghosts, no strange creatures, and no unexplained mysteries. Instead, it was the realization that sometimes the most terrifying situations come from ordinary people behaving in unpredictable ways. The incident happened during a family gathering at my aunt's house. She was hosting a dinner party, and as usual, the house was packed with relatives, friends, and neighbors. The atmosphere was warm and cheerful. Adults were gathered in different rooms, talking, laughing, and catching up with one another, while the kids moved between the backyard, living room, and kitchen, trying to entertain ourselves. My aunt's house sat on a hill overlooking the street. From the front yard, you could see the road below, along with a row of houses and several streetlights. It was a nice neighborhood, and nobody expected anything unusual to happen that evening. As the night went on, the party slowly began winding down. Some people had already started gathering their things and saying their goodbyes. Others were helping clean up after dinner. My brother and I were hanging around the living room, not really paying attention to the adults' conversations. Then we heard shouting. At first, it sounded distant, the kind of random noise you might hear coming from somewhere down the street. Most of us ignored it. A few moments later, however, the yelling became louder. The conversations inside the house began to slow as more people noticed it. The shouting didn't sound normal. It sounded angry. Several adults exchanged confused looks before someone decided to check outside. Naturally, curiosity spread through the house. One person went outside, then another. Before long, a large portion of the guests had gathered near the front of the property, trying to figure out what was happening. My brother and I followed the crowd. At that age, anything unusual immediately grabbed our attention. When we stepped outside, we saw the source of the noise. A man was standing across the street. Even though he wasn't directly on my aunt's property, he felt uncomfortably close. If you walked out through the garage and looked toward the left side of the road, there he was near one of the streetlights. Because the house sat on a hill, we were slightly elevated compared to the road below. Even so, there was no mistaking that he was focused on us. The man looked disheveled and agitated. He was yelling loudly. At first, it was difficult to understand exactly what he was saying. His words sounded scattered and aggressive. The more we listened, however, the more disturbing the situation became. He wasn't simply shouting random things. He was making threats. He repeatedly screamed that he was going to kill us. I remember feeling confused at first. As a child, I had never witnessed anything like this before. Part of me assumed it had to be some kind of joke. Another part of me could tell from the adults' reactions that it wasn't. The adults quickly began guiding everyone back inside the house. The atmosphere changed immediately. The cheerful feeling from the dinner party disappeared. Conversations became quieter. People started checking windows. Some guests locked doors, while others tried to figure out whether the man knew anyone at the gathering. Nobody seemed to recognize him. For a little while, things became quiet. Then, the yelling started again, louder this time. Several people cautiously looked outside once more. Curiosity and concern got the better of them. Eventually, a group of adults stepped outside to see what was happening. My brother and I followed again, despite probably being told not to. What we saw this time was much worse. The man was still there, but now he was holding a machete. Even as a child, I knew exactly what a machete was. The sight of that blade instantly changed everything. This wasn't just an angry person shouting anymore. Now there was a weapon involved. I remember seeing adults immediately become more serious. People who had previously seemed annoyed now looked genuinely concerned. The man continued yelling threats. He waved the machete around as he shouted. Then he began demonstrating how he was supposedly going to attack us. Every movement made the situation feel more dangerous. The reality that this was actually happening began sinking in. Among the adults present was my stepfather. He had spent many years working as a police officer before retiring. Because of his experience, he remained calmer than most of the people around him. While others stayed back, he attempted to reason with the man. I remember watching nervously as he spoke to him from a distance. At first, it seemed like he was trying to calm the situation down. Unfortunately, the man wasn't interested in listening. Instead, he suddenly began walking toward my stepfather. The sight immediately made everyone tense. As he approached, he repeatedly shouted the same phrase, "Are you gonna shoot me?" over and over again. The question echoed through the street, "Are you gonna shoot me?" Again and again and again. The repetition made the entire encounter feel surreal. My stepfather remained composed, but it was obvious that the situation was escalating. The man eventually stopped and moved back across the street. For a brief moment, it seemed like things might calm down. Instead, he resumed making threats. He started striking the nearby light post with the machete. The metallic clang echoed through the neighborhood. Each swing seemed designed to intimidate everyone watching. He wasn't just threatening people verbally anymore. He was physically demonstrating what he intended to do. As a child, I remember feeling frozen. I didn't fully understand everything that was happening, but I knew enough to realize it was serious. The adults clearly felt the same way. At that point, my brother and I were told to go back inside immediately. Unlike earlier, there was no room for argument. The adults wanted the children away from the situation. We reluctantly went back into the house. Even inside, however, we could still hear the shouting. Every loud yell made my stomach twist. The atmosphere inside the house was tense. People were talking quietly. Some stood near windows while trying not to make themselves obvious. Others were on the phone. At some point, the police were called. Everyone hoped officers would arrive quickly and bring the situation under control. Unfortunately, things didn't happen that way. By the time law enforcement reached the area, the man was already gone. Somehow, after making threats, waving a machete, and terrorizing an entire gathering of people, he managed to leave before officers arrived. According to what I later heard, he simply rode away on a bicycle. The image of someone causing that much fear and then casually leaving on a bike seemed almost absurd. Yet that's exactly what happened. Eventually, the immediate danger passed. The party was effectively over. Nobody felt much like celebrating anymore. People left shortly afterward, and everyone spent the rest of the night discussing what had happened. For years, I assumed that was the end of the story. Then I learned something even stranger. According to my aunt, the man eventually appeared in court regarding the incident. Everyone expected him to look exactly the way he had that night. Wild, disheveled, aggressive, the same intimidating person who had stood outside making threats with a machete. Instead, he apparently looked like an entirely different person. My aunt said he arrived clean and well-groomed. His hair was neatly slicked back. He wore a suit and tie. He appeared calm, composed, and completely sane. The transformation was so dramatic that it shocked the people who had witnessed the original incident. The image they remembered and the person standing in court seemed like two entirely different individuals. That detail always stuck with me, not because it was supernatural, but because it reminded me how complicated people can be. Sometimes the most frightening situations aren't caused by monsters hiding in the dark. They're caused by ordinary people whose behavior suddenly becomes unpredictable. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous that night could have been. At the time, I was mostly curious. I wanted to see what was happening. I treated it almost like an exciting event unfolding in front of me. As an adult, I understand why everyone was so concerned. An angry stranger armed with a machete was making direct threats toward a house full of people. That isn't something to take lightly. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. The situation ended without violence. The police were eventually involved, and life moved on. But even now, years later, I can still picture that streetlight, the dark road below the hill, and the man standing there yelling into the night. I've heard plenty of ghost stories and paranormal encounters over the years, but honestly, some of the scariest memories don't involve anything supernatural at all. Sometimes reality is more than enough. And for a 9 or 10-year-old kid standing outside his aunt's house, watching a stranger swing a machete around while making threats, it was definitely one of the most frightening things I had ever experienced. Even now, it's a night I haven't forgotten. When I was around 7 years old, I had an experience that scared me so badly that I still remember it years later. Looking back, there are probably a dozen logical explanations for what I saw, but at the time, none of those explanations mattered. I was a kid, and from my perspective, I had just seen something that absolutely should not have existed. The strange part is that the memory has never really faded. Most childhood fears eventually become funny stories. The monster under the bed turns out to be a pile of clothes. The shadow in the hallway turns out to be a coat hanging on a chair. But this experience has always stayed with me because of how vivid it felt in that moment. At the time, my younger brother and I were spending an ordinary afternoon at home. It was one of those days where nothing exciting was happening. No friends were over. There were no video games we wanted to play, no movies we were interested in watching, and no plans for the day. We were bored out of our minds, the kind of boredom only kids can experience, where every minute feels like an hour and you're desperate for something, anything to do. We were both sitting on the couch when my brother suddenly came up with an idea. Let's play hide and seek. It wasn't exactly an exciting suggestion, but it was better than sitting around doing nothing. So I agreed. At the time, my grandmother was living with us. She and my mom didn't always get along very well, and on that particular day, they were in the middle of an argument. Their voices drifted through parts of the house while my brother and I prepared for our game. As kids, we didn't really pay much attention to it. We were more focused on making our game as fun as possible. Before we started, I ran to my bedroom and grabbed 2 glow sticks. Looking back, it was completely unnecessary. It wasn't even dark outside yet. There was still plenty of daylight coming through the windows. But in our minds, glow sticks made everything more exciting. They made ordinary games feel like adventures. I handed 1 glow stick to my brother and kept the other for myself. Immediately, the game felt more serious, at least to us. Now, there's something important you should know about me as a child. I absolutely loved scary stories. Most kids my age avoided horror stories before bed. I actively searched for them. I would listen to creepy stories, watch scary videos whenever I could, and imagine all sorts of spooky scenarios. The fear didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed it. There was something exciting about getting that little adrenaline rush while knowing I was still safe. Unfortunately, when you spend enough time filling your head with horror stories, your imagination tends to become very active, especially when you're 7 years old. Since my brother had suggested the game, I ended up being it. I stood in the living room covering my eyes while counting. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 60. I could hear my brother running through the house looking for a hiding spot. By the time I reached 60, everything had gone quiet. The hunt began. I started searching room by room. Some areas of the house were completely off limits. For example, my grandmother's room was a place neither of us was allowed to hide. My mother, on the other hand, didn't really care if we entered her room. So naturally, that was the first place I checked. I pushed open the door and looked around. Nothing. No brother. No movement. Just an empty room. I moved on. The next obvious place to search was my bedroom. Before I explain what happened, it's important to understand the layout of the room. When you entered through the doorway, there was a television positioned immediately to the right against the wall. Along the right-hand wall sat a bunk bed. Directly ahead was another bunk bed, and to the left was the doorway leading into a small bathroom. It was a fairly crowded room, with plenty of places for a kid to hide. As I stepped inside, I immediately spotted my brother, or at least I spotted where he was hiding. He wasn't very good at hide and seek. Part of his body was clearly visible behind the television. I remember almost laughing. I was already preparing to call out that I had found him. Then I looked toward the bathroom doorway, and everything changed. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was something positioned near the top of the bathroom entrance, not standing in the doorway, not inside the bathroom. Above it, the sight was so strange that it took me several seconds to understand what I was looking at. It appeared to be a head. Just a head. A human-looking head attached to an impossibly long neck. The neck stretched downward into darkness, where I couldn't see the rest of whatever it belonged to. Long strands of hair hung around its face. The hair appeared dark and tangled. I remember staring at it in complete disbelief. Even now, I can still picture the image. The head seemed far too high to belong to a normal person. The proportions were completely wrong. The neck was too long. The positioning made no sense. For a brief moment, everything seemed frozen. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was clothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I wasn't seeing what I thought I was seeing. But none of those thoughts lasted very long. Fear took over. Instantly, the kind of fear that hits so hard, it feels physical. Every hair on my body stood up. My stomach dropped. My heart began hammering in my chest. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and get as far away from that room as possible. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. Then I remembered my brother. He was still hiding behind the television, and judging by the expression on his face, he had seen it too. I could tell he was scared. Really scared. The kind of scared where a child is trying not to cry, but is only seconds away from completely breaking down. For a moment, I found myself caught between two feelings: terror and responsibility. I know that sounds dramatic, considering I was only 7 years old, but that's exactly how it felt. I wanted to escape. At the same time, I couldn't leave my brother behind. The thing, or whatever I thought it was, remained perfectly still near the bathroom doorway, watching, or at least it felt like it was watching. I didn't wait to find out. I rushed across the room toward my brother. I grabbed his arm as quickly as I could. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The panic on both our faces said enough. The second I had hold of him, we ran. We practically stumbled out of the room. I didn't look back. Not once. I had no interest in seeing whether the thing was still there. All I cared about was getting out. We ran straight into the living room. My heart was beating so fast, I thought it might explode. Even after reaching safety, I couldn't calm down. The image remained burned into my mind. That impossibly long neck, that head near the top of the doorway, that feeling that something was terribly wrong. The rest of the evening is a blur. I don't remember explaining everything to my parents. I don't remember whether my brother described what he saw. What I do remember is refusing to sleep in my room that night. There was absolutely no chance of that happening. I slept in the living room instead. Every little sound made me nervous. Every shadow seemed suspicious. I kept replaying the image over and over in my mind. Part of me expected the thing to appear again. Part of me feared it was standing somewhere in the darkness, watching. Morning eventually arrived. The sunlight made everything seem less frightening. When I looked into my room again, nothing appeared unusual. The bathroom doorway looked completely normal. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. There was no sign of the strange figure. And perhaps the strangest part of all? I never saw it again. Not once. No matter how many times I entered that room afterward. No matter how many nights I slept there. No matter how many times I passed that bathroom doorway. The thing never returned. Years have passed since then. I've thought about the experience countless times. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe my imagination filled in details that weren't really there. Maybe the combination of glow sticks, scary stories, childhood fear, and an oddly shaped object created the perfect illusion. All of those explanations are possible. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. But here's the thing. At 7 years old, standing in that bedroom, none of those explanations existed. All I knew was that I had looked toward the bathroom doorway and seen something that terrified me more than anything else in my childhood. Whether it was real, imagined, or somewhere in between, the fear was absolutely real. And even now, after all these years, I can still remember exactly how it felt to grab my brother's arm and run out of that room as fast as I possibly could. Thankfully, whatever I saw that day never appeared again. And honestly, I'm perfectly okay with that. A lot of people expect scary experiences to happen in abandoned buildings, dark forests, or creepy places with a long history. Mine happened in the most ordinary place possible. My own house. Looking back, it wasn't the most terrifying thing that's ever happened, but it definitely startled me enough to remember it years later. At the time, it felt incredibly real, and unfortunately, it also cost me a perfectly good sandwich. I was 17 years old and working long shifts. On this particular day, I had just finished a 12-hour shift, and by the time I got home, I was completely exhausted. Every muscle in my body ached, my feet were sore, and I felt like I had been awake for days. The only thing keeping me moving was the thought of food. It was around 11 o'clock at night when I finally arrived home. The streets were quiet, and all I could think about was making myself a quick snack before collapsing into bed. As soon as I stepped inside, however, I noticed something was different. The house was unusually dark. At first, I didn't think much of it, because power outages were common where I lived. In the Caribbean, temporary outages happened fairly often as part of maintenance on the electrical system. Most people were used to it. Still, after spending 12 hours at work, the last thing I wanted to deal with was a blackout. I sighed and pulled out my phone. The flashlight immediately became my best friend. The bright beam cut through the darkness as I made my way toward the kitchen. Every shadow seemed larger than normal, and familiar rooms suddenly felt unfamiliar without electricity. The refrigerator hummed no longer. The usual glow from electronic devices was gone. The entire house felt strangely silent. I tried not to think about it. I was tired. I was hungry. And I had absolutely no interest in creeping myself out. Using my phone as a light source, I quickly prepared a snack. Nothing fancy, just something simple to satisfy my hunger before bed. After a few minutes, I finally had my sandwich ready and placed it on a glass plate. Mission accomplished. I grabbed my food, held my phone flashlight in front of me, and started making my way upstairs toward my room. Everything seemed perfectly normal, at least for a moment. I had reached the staircase and was about halfway up when I heard something. At first, I couldn't identify it. The sound came from somewhere downstairs. It was low, rough, almost like a growl. I stopped immediately. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to catch my attention. My first thought was confusion. We didn't own any pets, no dogs, no cats, no animals of any kind. So hearing what sounded like a growl inside the house instantly felt wrong. I stood there frozen on the stairs, listening. The darkness suddenly felt much heavier. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Then I heard it again, a low growling sound. My stomach tightened. Slowly I turned around and aimed my phone flashlight toward the area where I thought the noise had come from. The beam swept across the darkness. For a split second I saw something. Or at least I thought I did. Standing downstairs was a figure. The shape immediately reminded me of my father. The height, the build, the silhouette. For one brief moment, it looked exactly like him. The sight startled me so badly that I jumped. My heart practically exploded. The plate slipped from my hands. The sandwich flew. The glass plate crashed onto the floor. The noise echoed through the house. I stood there staring. My mind raced. Because there was one major problem. My father wasn't supposed to be there. He was away on a business trip. He had been gone for days. There was absolutely no reason he should have been standing downstairs in the dark. The realization only made the situation more frightening. For a second, my exhausted brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. I stared directly at the figure. Then my eyes adjusted, and everything changed. There was nothing there. No person, no shadowy intruder, no mysterious figure, just darkness. The shape I thought I had seen vanished completely. Whether it had been a trick of the light, a combination of exhaustion and shadows, or my imagination filling in details where none existed, I honestly don't know. All I know is that once my vision adjusted, the figure was gone. The growling had stopped, and I was left standing on the staircase, feeling incredibly stupid. After a few moments, I finally looked down at the floor. That's when a new tragedy became apparent. My sandwich was everywhere. Pieces of bread, fillings, and broken glass were scattered across the floor below. The snack I had spent the last several minutes preparing had become collateral damage in my brief moment of terror. At that point, I wasn't even scared anymore. I was annoyed. I had survived a 12-hour shift. I had made it home. I had successfully prepared food during a power outage, only to lose everything because my brain decided a random shadow looked like my father. I cleaned up the mess, still feeling embarrassed about how badly I had startled myself. The power eventually came back on later that night, and nothing else unusual happened. To this day, I still don't know exactly what caused the growling sound, or why I was so convinced I saw someone standing downstairs. Maybe exhaustion played a role. Maybe the darkness distorted my perception. Maybe my mind simply filled in the blanks when it couldn't clearly see what was in front of me. Whatever the explanation, the experience taught me two important lessons. First, Shadows can look a lot scarier when you're tired and alone in a dark house. And second, if you're carrying food during a creepy moment, make sure you have a better grip on the plate than I did. Because in the end, the scariest part of the entire experience wasn't the mysterious figure. It was realizing I had dropped my sandwich and was still hungry afterward. A few years ago, before my family moved, we lived in a house that had one room everyone seemed to avoid. It wasn't because anything obvious was wrong with it. It looked like an ordinary bedroom. The strange thing was that no matter what season it was, the room was always cold. Not cool, not slightly chilly. Freezing, you could walk through the hallway and feel perfectly comfortable. But the moment you stepped into that room, it felt like the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Everyone in the family noticed it, but nobody ever really questioned it. We just accepted it as one of those weird things about the house. The room belonged to my oldest sister. She also happened to collect Victorian-style porcelain dolls. If you've ever seen those old dolls, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. They had pale faces, glassy eyes, tiny painted smiles, and old-fashioned dresses that looked like they belonged in another century. Some people think they're beautiful. I was not one of those people. Even as a kid, those dolls made me uncomfortable. There was something about them that always felt wrong. Whenever I walked into my sister's room, I felt like they were watching me. Of course, I knew they weren't actually alive, but their eyes seemed to follow you around the room. I hated being alone with them. Eventually, my sister moved out. When she left, I got excited because it meant I would finally have a bigger bedroom. I couldn't wait to move in. The extra space felt amazing compared to my old room. What I didn't realize at the time was that my sister had left all of her dolls behind. Every single one of them. They remained sitting on shelves, dressers, and corners of the room as if they still owned the place. I was in middle school at the time and had recently joined the school band. I played the trombone. Anyone who has ever carried one around knows they aren't exactly lightweight. Mine stayed inside a hard protective case that weighed around 10 pounds. Every night I would place the case against the wall near my bed before going to sleep. It never moved. It was stable and secure. At least, it should have been. One night, I woke up around 3 in the morning. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, except for a little moonlight coming through the window. Then I noticed something strange. One of the porcelain dolls appeared to be leaning slightly to one side. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if it had always been positioned that way. Before I could think much about it, my trombone case suddenly tipped over and hit the floor. The sound nearly gave me a heart attack. I jumped out of bed immediately. After a few moments of checking the room, I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I hadn't balanced the case properly. Maybe it had simply fallen on its own. I picked it up, leaned it back against the wall, and climbed back into bed. Nothing else happened that night. The next day, I didn't think much about it. Then, the following night came. Again, it was sometime in the early morning. Again, I woke up unexpectedly, and again, my trombone case fell over. But this time wasn't the same. Not even close. Instead of simply tipping onto the floor, the case seemed to be thrown. I watched in disbelief as it moved several feet away from where it had been resting. It didn't just fall. It slid or flew across the room. For a moment, I couldn't process what I had just seen. Then things got even stranger. My ceiling fan had been running on a low setting all night. Without warning, it suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not like the power went out, it just stopped. At the exact same time, every loose piece of paper on my desk flew into the air. Homework assignments, notes, random papers, everything scattered across the room. The sight was so sudden and unexpected that I sat frozen in bed, staring at the mess. The room felt incredibly cold. colder than usual. I remember feeling like the air itself had become heavy. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get out of bed. I picked up the trombone case, gathered some of the papers, then climbed back under the covers. Surprisingly, nothing else happened that night. I wish I could say that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next several weeks, something new started happening. Every night, after I had fallen asleep, I would wake up feeling pressure on the side of my mattress. At first, I thought it was one of our cats. The sensation felt exactly like someone sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress would dip slightly. The weight felt real. Then I would feel fingers running through my hair. Slowly, gently, as if someone was trying to comfort me. The first few times it happened, I was too scared to move. I would lie completely still with my eyes shut. Every instinct told me not to look. Eventually, I tried explaining it away. Maybe one of the cats had gotten into my room. Maybe I was imagining things because I was tired. Then I remembered something important. I always slept with my bedroom door closed. Always. The cats couldn't get inside. Yet the feeling continued night after night. Someone, or something, seemed to sit beside me and play with my hair while I slept. The experience never felt violent. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply unsettling. No matter how many times it happened, I could never get used to it. Eventually, my family decided to move the dolls. Every single one of them was taken out of the room and placed in the basement. I remember feeling relieved. For the first time since moving into the room, I felt like I could finally relax. The strange thing was that the activity in my bedroom stopped almost immediately. No more pressure on the mattress. No more fingers running through my hair. No more waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was standing nearby. I thought the problem was solved. I was wrong. The basement became the new problem. Our Xbox was set up downstairs, and I spent a lot of time there playing games with friends. Whenever I was down there, I felt uncomfortable. It wasn't an obvious fear, just the persistent feeling that someone was watching me. I would glance over my shoulder constantly. Sometimes I would stop talking mid-conversation because I felt like there was someone standing behind me. Every time I checked, nobody was there. Then the hair touching started again. Only this time, it happened downstairs. I would be sitting on the couch gaming with friends online when I felt fingers lightly moving through my hair. The sensation was unmistakable. The same thing I had experienced in the bedroom. At first, I tried ignoring it. Then one day, something happened that convinced me I wasn't imagining everything. I had a friend over. We were hanging out in the basement together. At some point, she suddenly jumped and spun around. She looked genuinely frightened. When I asked what happened, she told me something had grabbed her, not brushed against her, not bumped into her, grabbed her. The expression on her face told me she wasn't joking. She looked terrified. That moment stuck with me because she knew nothing about the experiences I had been having. I hadn't told her, yet she reacted exactly the way I would have. After that, neither of us wanted to spend much time alone in the basement. Thankfully, life moved on. Eventually, my family moved out of that house. The dolls disappeared somewhere along the way. Honestly, I have no idea where they ended up. Maybe they were donated. Maybe they were packed away in storage. Maybe my sister took them back. I never asked. And I don't think I want to know. All I know is that after we moved, the strange experiences stopped. No more objects flying across rooms. No more pressure on the mattress. No more invisible fingers running through my hair. No more feeling watched every time I entered a room. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything that happened. Maybe stress, imagination, and coincidence combined to create a series of strange experiences. Or maybe there was something attached to those dolls that none of us understood. Whatever the truth is, I'm just glad those dolls aren't here anymore. And if someone ever offers me a collection of old Victorian porcelain dolls, I'll be politely declining. Some things are better left in the past. To this day, I still consider this one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. Whenever I tell people about it, most of them don't believe me. Some think I was dreaming, others think I imagined it because I was young. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not. All I know is that I remember every detail as clearly as if it happened yesterday. At the time, I was only 8 years old. I'm 13 now, almost 14, but the memory has never left me. It happened in the middle of the night. I remember waking up because I could hear my younger brother crying from another room. This wasn't unusual. He had nightmares all the time when we were kids, so hearing him call for our mom in the middle of the night wasn't anything new. At first, I ignored it. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but he kept crying and crying and crying. It felt like it went on forever. Every few seconds I could hear him calling for my mom. Normally she would calm him down pretty quickly, but for some reason it seemed to take much longer that night. By then, I was completely awake. I remember checking the time and seeing that it was around 2:58 in the morning. 10 minutes later, he was still crying. Now it was around 3:10 a.m., and there was no chance I was falling back asleep. I was lying there staring into the darkness, annoyed and tired. To understand what happened next, you need to know how my room was set up. My bed sat roughly in the center of the room. The bedroom door was to my left. Directly in front of my bed was a large window that faced outside. The window had curtains covering most of it, but one section in the middle was exposed because a curtain panel had fallen down some time before and hadn't been replaced yet. During the day, it wasn't a problem. At night, however, that empty section always made me feel a little uneasy. That night, I was lying on my back looking toward the ceiling while listening to my brother cry in the distance. The house was otherwise completely silent. Then I heard something, a tapping sound. At first, it was soft. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to be coming from the window. I froze. For a moment, I convinced myself it was probably a tree branch. Maybe the wind was blowing something against the glass. That explanation made sense, except there wasn't any wind. And the tapping continued. Slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was trying to get my attention. I remember closing my eyes for a moment because I didn't want to look. I was already scared. I didn't want to see whatever was making the noise. But curiosity got the better of me. Like most 8-year-olds, I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The second I looked toward the window, my blood ran cold. Standing outside was a clown. Not a normal clown. Not the kind you see at birthday parties. This thing looked horrifying. Its face was pale and twisted into the widest smile I had ever seen. The smile looked impossible. It stretched far beyond what seemed natural. Even worse, there appeared to be blood around its mouth. Dark streaks ran down its face and chin. The clown wasn't just standing there smiling, it was staring directly at me, and in one hand, it was holding a knife. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. The clown stood completely still outside my window, just watching me. Smiling, the image is burned into my memory. The pale face, the blood, the knife, the grin. Everything about it felt wrong. Then reality hit me all at once. I screamed. Not a little scream, not the kind of scream you make when you're startled. I screamed as loud as I possibly could. The kind of scream that comes from pure terror. Instantly, I started crying. I pulled my blankets up and couldn't stop shaking. Within seconds, I heard footsteps running down the hallway. My mom burst into the room. The moment she entered, I looked back toward the window. The clown was moving away. I watched as it ran off into the darkness. Within moments, it disappeared completely. Gone, just like that. My mom immediately started asking what was wrong. I was crying so hard I could barely speak. Eventually, I managed to point toward the window and tell her what I had seen. I told her there had been a clown outside. I described the face, the smile, the blood, the knife, everything. She looked outside, but didn't see anyone. Then, she looked back at me. Instead of believing me, she told me there was nobody there. She thought I had either been dreaming or making it up. I remember her saying she hated lies and telling me that there wasn't a clown outside. At the time, that almost upset me more than seeing the clown itself. I knew what I had seen. At least, I believed I did. Yet nobody else had seen it. Eventually, my mom calmed me down enough for me to stop crying. She stayed with me for a while until I settled down. But I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow made me nervous. I kept staring at the window, terrified that the clown would come back. Thankfully, it never did. The rest of the night passed without incident. Years have gone by since then. I've thought about that night countless times. Maybe it was a nightmare that felt real. Maybe I was half asleep and imagined it. Maybe the darkness distorted something outside into a terrifying shape. All of those explanations are possible, but none of them change how real it felt at the time. I can still remember the fear. I can still remember the tapping. I can still picture that horrifying smile staring at me through the uncovered section of the window. Sometimes I think about how differently the night might have gone. What if my brother hadn't been having a nightmare? What if his crying hadn't kept me awake? Would I have slept through everything? Would I have never seen the figure at all? Or would something else have happened? I'll never know. What I do know is that the experience changed me. Before that night, I never paid much attention to windows after dark. After that night, everything changed. Even now, years later, I make sure my curtains are fully closed before I go to sleep. Every single night. Because no matter how much time passes, a part of me still remembers waking up at 3 a.m. and seeing that smiling figure staring back at me through the glass. And honestly, I never want to risk seeing something like that again. I've had so many strange experiences throughout my life that it's hard to pick just one. Some of them were small and easy to brush off, while others stayed with me for years. Looking back, I genuinely believe my late mother's apartment was haunted. Whether people believe in that sort of thing or not, there were simply too many unexplained events that happened there for me to ignore. The apartment itself wasn't particularly old or creepy when you first walked in. During the day, it felt like any normal family home. Sunlight came through the windows, people moved around constantly, and life felt ordinary. But once the sun went down, the atmosphere changed completely. There was always a strange heaviness in the air. It felt as though someone was watching you from another room. My aunt used to visit often and perform tarot card readings in the apartment. She was very interested in spiritual practices and believed strongly in things beyond the physical world. Whether the tarot readings had anything to do with what happened afterward, I honestly don't know. But part of me has always wondered if those sessions somehow opened a door to something that shouldn't have been invited in. Over the years, countless strange things happened in that apartment. Some experiences were small enough that I could convince myself there was a logical explanation. Others were much harder to explain. I remember seeing shadowy figures moving through rooms when nobody was there, not full-bodied apparitions, just dark shapes that seemed to move at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned to look directly at them, they disappeared. At first, I blamed my imagination. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, or simply seeing things out of the corner of my eye. But the sightings continued, and they weren't the only things I saw. One night, I remember seeing what looked like a woman standing in the apartment. She wasn't someone I recognized. She wore what appeared to be an old-fashioned white nightgown or pajama dress, the kind of clothing that looked like it belonged to another era. For only a few moments, she stood there, completely still. Then, she was gone. I never saw her clearly enough to recognize a face. Yet I remember the image vividly. The white dress, the stillness, the unsettling feeling that came with seeing her. There were also nights when my bed would shake. Not a little vibration, not the kind caused by traffic outside or someone walking nearby. The shaking always seemed to come from underneath, as if someone was beneath the mattress pushing upward from below. The first time it happened, I sat up immediately and looked around the room. Nothing, no explanation, no source, just silence. Still, the feeling lingered. The sensation of movement had felt real, very real. Then there were the voices. More than once, I heard someone call my name. The voice sounded clear enough that I would immediately respond. Sometimes it sounded like a family member. Other times, it was impossible to identify. Every single time I checked, nobody had called for me. There were even occasions when I heard knocking on my bedroom door. Not gentle taps, actual knocks. The kind that makes you expect someone to be standing on the other side. I would get up and open the door. Nobody would be there. The strangest part was that some of these incidents happened when I was completely alone in the apartment. No family members, no visitors, nobody. Yet somehow I still heard my name. I still heard the knocks. I still felt as though someone else was there. As unsettling as those experiences were, the worst period came years later when I was pregnant with my first son. At the time, I was still living with my mother and the rest of my family. Pregnancy brought enough worries on its own. I was already nervous about becoming a parent, already dealing with the emotions and stress that come with preparing for a newborn. Then the strange activity seemed to intensify. One of the most unsettling things involved my sister's guitar. The guitar wasn't being used anymore. It sat in my room mostly as decoration. Nobody played it. Nobody touched it. It simply stood there. Then, late at night, I began hearing it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A faint sound, a single note, then another, the unmistakable sound of guitar strings being strummed. The noise would come from the corner of the room where the guitar sat, soft, slow, deliberate, as though invisible fingers were brushing across the strings. Every time it happened, I would stare toward the instrument. The room would be dark, silent, empty, yet the sounds continued. I never saw anyone near it. I never found any explanation. The guitar would simply play itself. The experience was unsettling enough on its own. What truly frightened me, however, were the dreams. As my due date approached, I started having incredibly vivid nightmares. These weren't ordinary bad dreams. They felt real, far too real. Night after night, I would dream about a dark presence, a shadowy figure with no clear face, no clear shape, just darkness. In every dream, it wanted the same thing: my baby. The shadow would appear and try to take my newborn son away from me. Sometimes I would be holding him, sometimes he would be sleeping nearby, but the dream always ended the same way. The shadow would move closer, and I would desperately try to protect him. I remember waking up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my hands instinctively reaching toward my stomach as if I needed to make sure he was still safe. The dreams became so frequent that I started dreading going to sleep. Every night felt like entering a battle I couldn't avoid. The fear followed me throughout the day. Even when I was awake, I couldn't stop thinking about those nightmares. Part of me knew they were probably fueled by anxiety. Many expectant mothers have intense dreams during pregnancy. I understood that. But because of everything else that had happened in the apartment, the nightmares felt connected to something larger, something darker, something I couldn't explain. The combination of hearing the guitar play by itself, seeing shadows, hearing voices, and then having those recurring dreams created a level of fear I had never experienced before. Every night, I wondered what might happen next. Every strange noise made me jump. Every shadow caught my attention. Even after all these years, those memories remain vivid. I've lived in other homes since then. I've experienced normal life, normal nights, and normal fears. Yet nothing has ever compared to what happened in that apartment. Maybe there were logical explanations for everything. Maybe the shadows were tricks of the light. Maybe the guitar strings vibrated naturally. Maybe the dreams were simply the result of stress and pregnancy. All of those explanations are possible. But when I think back to those nights, to the feeling of never truly being alone, to hearing my name whispered when nobody else was home, and to the dreams of something trying to take my child away, I still get chills. Whatever was happening in that apartment, it was enough to convince me that some places hold an energy you can't easily explain. And even now, years later, it's a chapter of my life I will never forget. One of the strangest memories from my childhood happened when I was around 7 years old during one of our huge family reunions. My family was very close, and whenever everyone got together, there would be dozens of people packed into the house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, every room seemed full of people talking, laughing, and catching up. As a kid, I loved those gatherings because it meant I got to spend time with all of my cousins. The older cousins would usually hang out together, while the younger ones ran around the house causing chaos. On this particular day, that's exactly what we were doing. A few of my younger cousins and I had been acting like complete brats. We were running through the house, making noise, and generally annoying everyone around us. Eventually, some of our older cousins got tired of dealing with us and came up with an idea. Why don't we play hide and seek? Instantly, all of us agreed. Our house was perfect for it. It was a large 3-story house with plenty of rooms, long hallways, closets, and hiding places. Every game felt different because there were so many places someone could disappear. I volunteered to be the seeker, not because I wanted to. Honestly, I was terrible at hiding. Whenever I played hide and seek, I was almost always the first person found. Finding people, however, was something I was surprisingly good at, so everyone scattered through the house while I stayed behind to count. I remember standing near my mom while covering my eyes and counting loudly. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 2 minutes. As I counted, I could hear footsteps thundering through the house as everyone searched for the perfect hiding spot. Doors opened and closed. People laughed. Someone nearly tripped while running upstairs. It was exactly the kind of chaos you'd expect from a house full of cousins. When the time was up, I announced that I was coming to find everyone. The hunt began. At first, it was easy. One of my oldest cousins was the first person I found. She had bright ginger hair that practically glowed whenever light hit it, making her a terrible hider despite how hard she tried. I found her almost immediately. After that, I worked my way through the house, under beds, behind furniture, inside spare rooms. One by one, everyone was discovered. Each time I found someone, they joined me as I continued searching for the others. Before long, I had located almost every single cousin. Almost. There was one person missing. Jake. Jake was 16 years old and easily the best hider among all of us. He knew our house incredibly well and always managed to find places nobody else considered. The longer I searched, the more confident I became that he was still hidden somewhere inside. I checked the usual spots. Nothing. I searched the basement. Nothing. I looked behind furniture, inside spare rooms, and even under staircases. Still nothing. Then I realized there was one room I hadn't checked. My grandmother's room. Normally, we avoided it during games because she didn't like us making a mess in there. Still, if Jake wanted to stay hidden, it would be the perfect place. I quietly made my way toward the room. The hallway seemed strangely quiet compared to the rest of the house. Most of the excitement from the game was happening elsewhere, leaving this part of the house almost completely silent. I pushed the bedroom door open. The room was dimly lit. Everything looked normal. For a moment, I thought maybe Jake wasn't there after all. Then I noticed the closet. The closet door wasn't completely closed. There was a small gap, just wide enough to peek through. Immediately I smiled. I was convinced I had finally found him. Slowly I walked closer. The excitement of winning made me move faster. I leaned toward the gap and looked inside. That's when I saw it. An eye. Just one eye staring back at me from the darkness. At first, I didn't think anything was unusual. I laughed. Of course Jake was in there. I had finally found him. "Haha, Jake. I found you," I shouted. The eye didn't move. Whoever or whatever was behind the door continued staring at me. I waited for Jake to laugh and step out. Nothing happened. The eye remained perfectly still. I laughed again. "Jake, come on. I found you." Still nothing. No movement. No response. Just that eye watching me from inside the closet. At this point, I started feeling slightly confused. Jake wasn't the type to stay silent after being caught. Normally, he would jump out, laugh, or try to scare someone. This was different. The silence felt wrong. I stood there, staring into the darkness. The eye continued staring back. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then suddenly, I heard movement behind me. Before I could even turn around, someone burst out from behind the bedroom curtains. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Jake, laughing hysterically. He had been hiding behind the curtains the entire time. For a moment, I was too shocked to react. My brain couldn't process what had just happened. Jake was behind me. Not inside the closet. Not behind the closet door. Behind me. Exactly where he had just jumped from. The realization hit me immediately. If Jake had been behind the curtains the entire time, then what had I been looking at inside the closet? The laughter around me suddenly felt distant. I slowly turned my head back toward the closet. The gap in the door was still there. The darkness inside remained unchanged. But the eye was gone. Completely gone. The space where it had been staring from was now empty. I remember feeling a cold sensation run through my body. Not fear exactly. At least not immediately. More confusion than anything else. I stared at the closet for several moments, trying to make sense of it. Maybe there had been something inside that reflected light. Maybe I had mistaken a shadow for an eye. Maybe my imagination had filled in details because I was expecting to find Jake. Those explanations made sense. At least, they should have. Yet, even as a child, something about the experience bothered me. The eye had looked real. Not like a reflection, not like a shadow. It had felt as though something was genuinely looking back at me. I never opened the closet door. Even now, I can't explain why. Part of me simply didn't want to. Instead, I walked away and joined everyone else as if nothing had happened. The game continued. The family reunion carried on. People laughed, ate food, and enjoyed themselves. But throughout the rest of the day, I kept thinking about that eye. Years have passed since then. I've replayed the memory countless times in my head. I've tried to come up with logical explanations. And honestly, there probably is one. Children notice strange things. Our imaginations are powerful. A dark closet and a game of hide and seek are the perfect ingredients for seeing something that isn't really there. That's what I tell myself anyway. Still, whenever I remember that day, one question always comes back. If Jake was hiding behind the curtains the entire time, then what was staring at me from inside the closet? This happened fairly recently, and even though it was a short experience, it's probably one of the most unsettling things that has ever happened to me. I've tried to come up with a logical explanation for it many times, but every time I think about that night, I still get chills. I live with my mom, dad, and brother. We're a pretty normal family, and most evenings are usually the same. My parents like watching movies together, and my brother often joins them. Me, on the other hand, have never really been interested in sitting downstairs for family movie nights. It's not that I don't like spending time with them, it's just not my thing. One evening, my family was downstairs watching a movie together while I stayed in my room. The movie had already been on for quite a while. I knew they were at least halfway through it, because I'd seen them settle in long before. Because of that, I was pretty confident nobody would be coming upstairs anytime soon. I was sitting in my room near the doorway. The door was open, and from where I was sitting, I could see part of the upstairs hallway. Now, I should probably admit something. I was eating upstairs. We aren't really supposed to eat in our bedrooms, but I was hungry and didn't feel like going downstairs where everyone would immediately notice. So I had secretly brought some food up with me and was quietly eating while scrolling on my phone. Everything felt completely normal. The house was quiet except for the faint sounds of the movie coming from downstairs. Every now and then I could hear distant laughter or dialogue drifting up through the floorboards. Then I looked toward the hallway. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. I turned my head and saw what looked exactly like my brother. He was walking from the direction of the bathroom toward his bedroom. At first, I didn't think much of it, but almost immediately, something felt strange. The hallway lights were off, the bathroom light was off, his bedroom light was off. Everything upstairs was dark, yet he appeared to be casually walking through the darkness. That wasn't like him at all. My brother always turned lights on when moving around at night. He hated walking through dark rooms, especially upstairs where the hallway could get pretty gloomy after sunset. I remember watching him and feeling slightly confused. Then another thought hit me. Why was he upstairs at all? The rest of my family was downstairs watching the movie. The movie was still playing. Nobody had come upstairs. At least, I hadn't heard anyone. Still, I figured maybe he had gone to the bathroom and was heading back downstairs. That seemed reasonable. So I waited. I expected him to walk into his room, grab whatever he needed, and come back out. A few seconds passed. Nothing. A minute passed. Still nothing. I kept staring toward his doorway. No movement. No lights. No sounds. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I got up from my chair and walked into the hallway. Everything felt strangely quiet. I headed toward my brother's room expecting to find him sitting inside. Maybe he was looking for something. Maybe he had forgotten an item. Maybe I was overthinking everything. I reached his doorway and looked inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. For a moment I just stood there staring. I checked the corners of the room. Nothing. I looked behind the door. Nothing. There was absolutely nobody there. My stomach immediately dropped. I knew what I had seen. I had watched someone walk into that room. There was no other way to explain it. The hallway wasn't large. There were no alternate exits. Nobody could have slipped past me without being noticed. Yet the room was empty. I remember feeling a sudden wave of fear wash over me, the kind that starts in your stomach and spreads through your entire body. Every hair on my arms stood up. I slowly backed out of the room and looked around the hallway again. Everything was still. The bathroom door was open. The lights remained off. The silence felt overwhelming. For a few seconds, I genuinely didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run downstairs immediately. Another part of me was trying desperately to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe I had mistaken a shadow for my brother. Maybe I hadn't been paying enough attention. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. But the problem was that I had seen the figure clearly. It looked exactly like him. The height, the build, the way he walked. Everything. I eventually made my way downstairs and casually checked on everyone. My parents were still watching the movie. And there was my brother, sitting right there with them, exactly where he had supposedly been the entire time. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there trying to process what had happened. To everyone else, it was a normal evening. To me, it felt like reality had briefly stopped making sense. Even now, whenever I think back to that night, I can't fully explain it. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I caught a glimpse of a shadow and my brain filled in the details. Maybe there is a completely logical explanation that I've never considered. But in that moment, it felt absolutely real. I was convinced I had watched my brother walk from the bathroom to his bedroom. I saw him enter the room. I waited for him to come back out. And when I checked, there was nobody there. Out of all the strange things I've experienced, it wasn't the loudest, the most dramatic, or the most dangerous, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, because for a few moments, I was certain I had seen someone who wasn't really there, and honestly, that's what still gives me chills whenever I remember it. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened. Even though decades have passed since that day, it remains one of the clearest and most unsettling memories of my childhood. Some memories fade with time, becoming blurry around the edges, but this one has stayed with me in a way that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. Back then, my family would often spend weekends at a popular recreational spot in South Georgia. It wasn't a natural lake. The place had been built by a local owner who dug out a massive pond and transformed it into a family attraction. He covered the shoreline with imported beach sand, planted palm trees around the property, and charged people a small admission fee to spend the day there. Families would arrive early in the morning with coolers, folding chairs, charcoal grills, and enough food to last the entire afternoon. To a child, it felt almost like a beach resort. Cars lined the parking area, kids ran barefoot through the sand, and the smell of sunscreen mixed with smoke from dozens of barbecue grills. People swam, played games, and relaxed, while country music drifted from portable radios scattered around the shore. One of the biggest attractions was a giant water slide. Looking back now as an adult, I have no idea how that thing was ever considered safe. It seemed enormous to me at the time, and kids were constantly climbing up the ladder to race down into the water below. Every visit seemed to involve someone scraping a knee, bumping their head, or getting hurt in some way. But when you're a kid, danger rarely crosses your mind. All you see is excitement. My family always parked in roughly the same area whenever we visited. Directly across from our usual spot was a small island made almost entirely of sand. It wasn't very large, just a little patch of land sticking out of the water about 30 yards from shore. To adults, it probably seemed insignificant, but to me it felt like an adventure destination. I wasn't a strong swimmer at that age. I could stay afloat and move around in the water, but I wasn't confident enough to swim long distances. Fortunately, the water between the shore and the island wasn't extremely deep. In most places, it was just slightly above my head. Because of that, I developed my own way of getting there. I would bounce along the bottom of the lake, pushing off with my feet, briefly rising above the water, then dropping back down before repeating the process. I spent a lot of time doing that. It felt like a game. I'd make my way toward the island, climb onto the sand for a few minutes, then bounce back to shore again. It was one of my favorite things to do whenever we visited. On one particular day, everything seemed completely normal at first. The weather was warm, the water was calm, and the beach was crowded with families enjoying themselves. Children were laughing and splashing around while adults relaxed nearby. Nothing seemed unusual. At some point during the afternoon, I decided to head back out to the little island again. I entered the water and began making my usual journey. I remember moving slowly, bouncing up and down through the water, just as I had done countless times before. Then something happened that instantly changed the day. As I pushed off the bottom during one of my steps, my foot landed on something beneath the water. At first, I didn't understand what I had touched. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't mud. It wasn't a branch. The sensation was completely different. My foot came down onto something soft, but solid at the same time. For a brief second, my toe slid across what felt unmistakably like a nose. Even as a child, I knew immediately that what I had touched wasn't normal. Then came the feeling that has never left me. As I jerked my foot away, I felt hair moving between my toes. I can still remember it with horrifying clarity. The water caused the strands to drift and wave gently, wrapping around my foot for just an instant before slipping away. It was fine hair, floating naturally in the current. Even now, after nearly 40 years, I can recall the exact sensation. The moment it happened, pure panic shot through me. I didn't stop to think logically about what it might have been. I didn't investigate. I didn't look underwater. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong. I immediately turned around and made my way back toward shore as quickly as I could. My heart was racing. I remember feeling confused and frightened, though I couldn't fully explain why. I was only a child. I knew something had scared me, but I didn't understand the significance of what I had felt. Once I reached the beach, I stayed out of the water. My family probably assumed I was tired or simply wanted a break. I don't remember telling anyone exactly what had happened. If I did mention it, it certainly wasn't with the urgency that it deserved. To my young mind, it was just a terrifying mystery that I wanted to avoid. So I sat there on the sand, trying to shake off the strange feeling. As the afternoon continued, the atmosphere around the lake slowly began to change. At first, it was subtle. I noticed adults walking around looking concerned. Then I started hearing voices carrying across the beach. People were calling out a name, again and again. Parents began asking strangers if they had seen a little boy. Their voices grew increasingly desperate with each passing minute. Even as a child, I could sense that something serious was happening. The carefree mood that had filled the lake earlier started to disappear. Conversations became quieter. Groups of people gathered together, scanning the water and shoreline. The parents searching for their son looked terrified. I remember seeing the fear on their faces, even though I was too young to fully understand it. They moved from family to family, asking questions, hoping someone had seen him. Nobody had. As time passed, more people joined the search. The realization slowly spread across the beach that a child was missing. The water that had seemed so inviting only hours earlier suddenly felt ominous. People stared across the surface, looking for any sign of movement. I sat quietly on the shore, watching everything unfold. and somewhere in the back of my mind was the memory of what my foot had touched beneath the water. I didn't connect the dots right away. I don't think I truly understood until later. Eventually, searchers focused their attention near the small island, the same island I had been visiting all day, the same island where I had felt something beneath my foot. The area became crowded with adults looking into the water. Then, after what felt like forever, they found him. The little boy's body was recovered from beneath the surface, right near that island. I remember the moment with painful clarity. The reactions of the adults, the sudden silence, the crying, the realization that the search was over, but not in the way anyone had hoped. As a child, death was something distant and difficult to comprehend. I knew it was sad. I knew something terrible had happened, but I couldn't process it the way an adult could. What stayed with me most wasn't the recovery effort or even the crowd's reaction. It was the memory of what I had felt, the horrifying realization that while I had been innocently bouncing through the water, I had unknowingly stepped on the missing child. The nose beneath my toe, the hair drifting through the water, the instant fear that followed. For years afterward, I rarely talked about it. Life moved on. I grew older. Childhood became adulthood. New experiences filled my life, and many old memories faded away. But that one never did. Even now, at 47 years old, I can recall every detail of that moment as if it happened yesterday. I can picture the lake. I can see the sandy shoreline and the palm trees. I can hear the laughter of families enjoying their day. I can remember the voices calling out that little boy's name. Most of all, I can remember that feeling. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes we forget birthdays, names, or entire years of our lives. Yet certain moments become permanently etched into our minds. For me, it wasn't a sound or an image that stayed behind. It was a sensation. The feeling of hair drifting between my toes beneath dark water. A sensation that lasted only a second. A sensation I have never forgotten. Nearly 4 decades have passed, and I still think about that day from time to time. I still wonder about the little boy and the family whose lives changed forever. What began as an ordinary summer afternoon at a crowded lake became a memory that followed me into adulthood. Whenever I remember it, I am transported right back to that moment in the water. I can feel the panic, the confusion, and the instinctive fear that rushed through me before I even understood why. Some childhood memories make us smile when we look back. Others remind us of simpler times. This one reminds me how quickly an ordinary day can become something unforgettable and how a single moment can remain with a person for the rest of their life. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened. Even though decades have passed since that day, it remains one of the clearest and most unsettling memories of my childhood. Some memories fade with time, becoming blurry around the edges, but this one has stayed with me in a way that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. Back then, my family would often spend weekends at a popular recreational spot in South Georgia. It wasn't a natural lake. The place had been built by a local owner who dug out a massive pond and transformed it into a family attraction. He covered the shoreline with imported beach sand, planted palm trees around the property, and charged people a small admission fee to spend the day there. Families would arrive early in the morning with coolers, folding chairs, charcoal grills, and enough food to last the entire afternoon. To a child, it felt almost like a beach resort. Cars lined the parking area, kids ran barefoot through the sand, and the smell of sunscreen mixed with smoke from dozens of barbecue grills. People swam, played games, and relaxed, while country music drifted from portable radios scattered around the shore. One of the biggest attractions was a giant water slide. Looking back now as an adult, I have no idea how that thing was ever considered safe. It seemed enormous to me at the time. and kids were constantly climbing up the ladder to race down into the water below. Every visit seemed to involve someone scraping a knee, bumping their head, or getting hurt in some way. But when you're a kid, danger rarely crosses your mind. All you see is excitement. My family always parked in roughly the same area whenever we visited. Directly across from our usual spot was a small island made almost entirely of sand. It wasn't very large, just a little patch of land sticking out of the water about 30 yards from shore. To adults, it probably seemed insignificant, but to me it felt like an adventure destination. I wasn't a strong swimmer at that age. I could stay afloat and move around in the water, but I wasn't confident enough to swim long distances. Fortunately, the water between the shore and the island wasn't extremely deep. In most places, it was just slightly above my head. Because of that, I developed my own way of getting there. I would bounce along the bottom of the lake, pushing off with my feet, briefly rising above the water, then dropping back down before repeating the process. I spent a lot of time doing that. It felt like a game. I'd make my way toward the island, climb onto the sand for a few minutes, then bounce back to shore again. It was one of my favorite things to do whenever we visited. On one particular day, everything seemed completely normal at first. The weather was warm, the water was calm, and the beach was crowded with families enjoying themselves. Children were laughing and splashing around, while adults relaxed nearby. Nothing seemed unusual. At some point during the afternoon, I decided to head back out to the little island again. I entered the water and began making my usual journey. I remember moving slowly, bouncing up and down through the water, just as I had done countless times before. Then, something happened that instantly changed the day. As I pushed off the bottom during one of my steps, my foot landed on something beneath the water. At first, I didn't understand what I had touched. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't mud. It wasn't a branch. The sensation was completely different. My foot came down onto something soft, but solid at the same time. For a brief second, my toes slid across what felt unmistakably like a nose. Even as a child, I knew immediately that what I had touched wasn't normal. Then came the feeling that has never left me. As I jerked my foot away, I felt hair moving between my toes. I can still remember it with horrifying clarity. The water caused the strands to drift and wave gently, wrapping around my foot for just an instant before slipping away. It was fine hair, floating naturally in the current. Even now, after nearly 40 years, I can recall the exact sensation. The moment it happened, pure panic shot through me. I didn't stop to think logically about what it might have been. I didn't investigate. I didn't look underwater. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong. I immediately turned around and made my way back toward shore as quickly as I could. My heart was racing. I remember feeling confused and frightened, though I couldn't fully explain why. I was only a child. I knew something had scared me, but I didn't understand the significance of what I had felt. Once I reached the beach, I stayed out of the water. My family probably assumed I was tired or simply wanted a break. I don't remember telling anyone exactly what had happened. If I did mention it, it certainly wasn't with the urgency that it deserved. To my young mind, it was just a terrifying mystery that I wanted to avoid. So I sat there on the sand, trying to shake off the strange feeling. As the afternoon continued, the atmosphere around the lake slowly began to change. At first, it was subtle. I noticed adults walking around looking concerned. Then I started hearing voices carrying across the beach. People were calling out a name, again and again. Parents began asking strangers if they had seen a little boy. Their voices grew increasingly desperate with each passing minute. Even as a child, I could sense that something serious was happening. The carefree mood that had filled the lake earlier started to disappear. Conversations became quieter. Groups of people gathered together, scanning the water and shoreline. The parents searching for their son looked terrified. I remember seeing the fear on their faces, even though I was too young to fully understand it. They moved from family to family, asking questions, hoping someone had seen him. Nobody had. As time passed, more people joined the search. The realization slowly spread across the beach that a child was missing. The water that had seemed so inviting only hours earlier suddenly felt ominous. People stared across the surface, looking for any sign of movement. I sat quietly on the shore, watching everything unfold. And somewhere in the back of my mind was the memory of what my foot had touched beneath the water. I didn't connect the dots right away. I don't think I truly understood until later. Eventually, searchers focused their attention near the small island, the same island I had been visiting all day, the same island where I had felt something beneath my foot. The area became crowded with adults looking into the water. Then, after what felt like forever, they found him. The little boy's body was recovered from beneath the surface, right near that island. I remember the moment with painful clarity, the reactions of the adults, the sudden silence, the crying, the realization that the search was over, but not in the way anyone had hoped. As a child, death was something distant and difficult to comprehend. I knew it was sad. I knew something terrible had happened, but I couldn't process it the way an adult could. What stayed with me most wasn't the recovery effort or even the crowd's reaction. It was the memory of what I had felt. The horrifying realization that while I had been innocently bouncing through the water, I had unknowingly stepped on the missing child. The nose beneath my toe, the hair drifting through the water, the instant fear that followed. For years afterward, I rarely talked about it. Life moved on. I grew older. Childhood became adulthood. New experiences filled my life, and many old memories faded away. But that one never did. Even now, at 47 years old, I can recall every detail of that moment as if it happened yesterday. I can picture the lake. I can see the sandy shoreline and the palm trees. I can hear the laughter of families enjoying their day. I can remember the voices calling out that little boy's name. Most of all, I can remember that feeling. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes we forget birthdays, names, or entire years of our lives. Yet certain moments become permanently etched into our minds. For me, it wasn't a sound or an image that stayed behind. It was a sensation. The feeling of hair drifting between my toes beneath dark water. A sensation that lasted only a second. A sensation I have never forgotten. Nearly 4 decades have passed before I even understood why. Some childhood memories make us smile when we look back. Others remind us of simpler times. This one reminds me how quickly an ordinary day can become something unforgettable, and how a single moment can remain with a person for the rest of their life. And I still think about that day from time to time. I still wonder about the little boy and the family whose lives changed forever. What began as an ordinary summer afternoon at a crowded lake became a memory that followed me into adulthood. Whenever I remember it, I am transported right back to that moment in the water. I can feel the panic, the confusion, and the instinctive fear that rushed through me. This happened either very late on New Year's Eve 2025 or extremely early in the morning on New Year's Day 2026. Even now, none of us can fully explain what happened that night, and whenever the story comes up, everyone who was there still gets uncomfortable talking about it. At the time, I was at a sleepover with 4 of my friends. We had spent the evening doing what most teenagers do during a sleepover, eating junk food, talking about random things, scrolling through our phones and trying to stay awake as long as possible. The sleepover was at one of my friend's houses, a home that had been built sometime in the 1970s. It wasn't creepy by itself. In fact, it was a pretty normal house. But like a lot of older homes, it had a certain atmosphere at night. The hallways creaked occasionally, the floors made noises when people walked across them, and some of the rooms felt darker than they should have. None of us thought much about that. We were all gathered in the living room, where we planned to spend the night sleeping on blankets and sleeping bags spread across the floor. Earlier in the evening, we had decided to watch horror movies. Looking back, that probably didn't help the situation. One of the movies we watched was The Conjuring, Last Rites. The movie had already put everyone on edge. Even the people who claimed horror movies didn't scare them were jumping at some of the scenes. By the time the movie ended, the house had become completely quiet. Outside, the neighborhood was asleep. Inside, only a few lamps remained on. Most of us were trying to relax before finally going to sleep. At some point, one of my friends got up and walked into the kitchen. She was slightly shorter than me, probably somewhere between 5'7" and 5'9". She wasn't the type of person who got scared easily, and she definitely wasn't someone who would scream over nothing. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, we heard it, a scream. Not the kind of scream people let out when they're joking around, not the kind of scream you make when a pet surprises you or someone startles you from around a corner. This was different. It was loud, sharp, pure panic. The kind of scream that instantly makes your heart drop because you know something is seriously wrong. Every single one of us jumped up. Without even thinking, we ran toward the kitchen. My friend was standing there looking absolutely terrified. Her face had gone pale. Her eyes were wide. For a second, she couldn't even speak. We immediately started asking questions. What happened? Are you okay? What did you see? It took her a few moments before she finally managed to explain. When she did, the entire room went silent. She told us she had been standing in the kitchen facing the window. The kitchen layout was important. Directly across from the kitchen was the dining room, which also had a large window. Because of the way the glass reflected light inside the house, you could sometimes see reflections from different parts of the room depending on where you stood. According to her, she had glanced at the window and noticed something in the reflection. At first, she thought it was one of us. Then she realized it wasn't. Standing behind her in the reflection was a man. Not an ordinary man. Something much taller. She estimated that he looked close to 7 feet tall. The way she described him still makes me uncomfortable. She said he had an unnaturally long neck, a sharply defined jawline, sunken cheeks, pale skin that looked almost white, not normal pale, more like the color of a corpse. The most disturbing part was his face, or rather, the lack of it. She claimed he had no visible nose, no lips, and where his eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty holes. Not eyes, not shadows, just black voids staring directly at her. She said she could only see his head, nothing below the neck, just a face hovering behind her in the reflection. Watching, the moment she noticed it, she screamed. Naturally, the rest of us were skeptical at first. We assumed there had to be an explanation. Maybe she had mistaken a reflection. Maybe a shadow had lined up perfectly with something in the room. Maybe her mind was still influenced by the horror movie. We started investigating immediately. Every single one of us stood exactly where she had been standing. We looked into the same window. We examined the kitchen. Then we moved into the dining room. We checked every possible angle, every reflection, every light source, every object that might have created an illusion. Nothing, no matter what we tried, nobody could recreate what she had seen. We spent a surprisingly long time searching. We moved chairs, turned lights on and off, walked around the room, trying to find some combination of reflections that could explain it. Still nothing. The more we searched, the stranger it became, because my friend remained absolutely convinced about what she had seen. She never changed her story, not once. Every time we asked her to describe it again, the details remained the same. The height, the pale skin, the long neck, the empty eye sockets, the missing nose and lips. Everything. As the minutes passed, the mood inside the house became increasingly tense. The excitement from the sleepover was gone. Nobody was laughing anymore. Everyone kept glancing toward the windows. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every creak from the old house suddenly sounded much louder. It didn't help that we had just spent hours watching a horror movie. The images from the film were still fresh in our minds. Every little noise felt amplified. At one point, someone suggested maybe we should just go back to the living room and forget about it. Nobody wanted to be alone. Nobody wanted to stay in the kitchen. Eventually, one of my friends found a rosary in the house. I honestly don't remember whose idea it was. Maybe someone was joking. Maybe someone was genuinely scared. But before long, we were all gathered together holding the rosary and praying. Looking back, it's kind of funny. 5 terrified teenagers standing in a living room after midnight because one person saw something in a window reflection. But at the time, it didn't feel funny at all. It felt very real. I remember glancing toward the hallway multiple times, half expecting to see something standing there. Every time someone moved suddenly, everyone jumped. Nobody wanted to admit how scared they were, but it was obvious. The atmosphere felt completely different from earlier that evening. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with us. The house remained quiet. Nothing else happened. No strange figures appeared. No mysterious noises came from the kitchen. No unexplained shadows crossed the walls. The rest of the night passed without incident. Still, none of us slept particularly well. The next morning, things felt more normal. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The house looked like an ordinary home again. The fear from the previous night seemed less intense, yet the memory remained. Years later, whenever we talk about that sleepover, the story always comes up. Some people think there must have been a logical explanation. Others aren't so sure. What makes the story difficult to dismiss completely is that we never found an answer. Usually, strange experiences eventually make sense. You discover it was a reflection, a shadow, a trick of perspective, something. But in this case, despite all our efforts, we never found anything that matched her description. No object, no reflection, no explanation. To this day, my friend insists she knows exactly what she saw. A tall figure standing behind her in the reflection. A face with hollow eyes, pale skin, a long neck, and a stare that felt completely wrong. Whether it was a trick of the mind, a reflection that vanished before we could recreate it, or something none of us can explain, we'll probably never know. What I do know is that I've never forgotten the sound of that scream. Because it wasn't the scream of someone playing around. It was the scream of someone who genuinely believed they were looking at something that should not have been there. And honestly, that's the part that still unsettles me the most. Several years ago, my wife and I had an experience that neither of us has ever been able to explain. It wasn't the kind of story where we saw a ghost, heard mysterious voices, or witnessed something supernatural standing in front of us. In fact, we never actually saw anything at all. What made it so terrifying was the feeling. To this day, it remains the most intense sense of danger I have ever experienced in my life. At the time, my wife and I regularly spent nights at a place called Blue Stilly Park along the Stillaguamish River in Arlington, Washington. We loved going there. It was peaceful, quiet, and far enough away from everyday life that it felt like a small escape from the world. We had visited countless times before. The sound of the river, the fresh air, and the isolation were exactly what attracted us to the place. On the evening this happened, we arrived planning to spend the night like we always did. At first, everything seemed normal. The weather was fine. The river moved steadily through the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. Nothing looked unusual. Yet almost immediately after arriving, I felt something I couldn't explain. A feeling settled in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like a warning, an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. At first, I ignored it. Everyone gets strange feelings sometimes. I figured I was tired or stressed, but as time passed, the feeling refused to go away. Instead, it grew stronger. The longer I stayed there, the more uncomfortable I became. Eventually, I turned to my wife and told her I thought we should leave. That wasn't normal for me. I wasn't the type of person who packed up because of a bad feeling. But something deep inside me was screaming that we shouldn't stay. My wife was pregnant with our second child at the time. Because of that, I didn't want her walking back and forth carrying gear. I told her to stay in the car while I packed everything up. She agreed. The problem was that our setup was near the river. The parking area wasn't right next to the water. There was a decent walk between the riverside and where the vehicle was parked. That meant multiple trips. The first trip wasn't too bad. I carried a load of equipment back to the car and returned for more. The uneasy feeling remained. The second trip was worse. Darkness had fully settled over the area by then. The park felt different at night. The familiar surroundings suddenly seemed unfamiliar. The trees appeared taller. The shadows seemed deeper. The spaces between sounds felt unnaturally quiet. With every trip, the feeling intensified. By the time I started what would be my second to last trip, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't explain why. I couldn't point to anything specific. But every instinct I possessed was telling me to leave. Fast, I returned to the car and told my wife to keep the engine running. I wasn't taking any chances. Then I grabbed a flashlight and my hatchet before heading back down toward the river for the final load. Looking back, that decision alone says a lot about how frightened I already was. I wasn't worried about wild animals. I wasn't worried about other people. I didn't even know what I was worried about. I just knew I didn't want to be unarmed. As I walked back down the path toward the river, something happened that immediately made my fear worse. Everything became silent. Not normal silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. The Stillaguamish River was always loud enough to hear nearby. Its flowing water was constant background noise. Yet suddenly I couldn't hear it anymore. The wind had disappeared too. No rustling leaves, no insects, no distant sounds, nothing. The only thing I could hear was my own movement. Every step I took through the sand sounded impossibly loud. The crunch beneath my boots seemed to echo through the darkness. It felt like the entire world had gone quiet except for me, and somehow that terrified me more than any noise could have. I stopped for a moment and listened. Nothing, just silence. A deep, unnatural silence. At that exact moment, every fiber of my being began screaming the same message. Get out. Now, not tomorrow. Not in 10 minutes. Right now. The feeling was so intense that it bypassed rational thought entirely. I didn't stop to analyze it. I didn't try to reason with it. I simply obeyed. The remaining gear was still scattered around our setup near the river. Normally, I would have packed everything neatly and organized it properly. Not this time. I grabbed our tarp and threw everything into it. Camping gear, supplies, anything I could reach. I didn't care if it was packed correctly. I just wanted it off the ground. Within seconds, I had bundled everything into one giant makeshift sack. It looked like something Santa Claus would carry over his shoulder. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was leaving. I slung the tarp over one shoulder. I gripped the hatchet tightly in one hand. The flashlight ended up clenched between my teeth. Then I ran. Not jogged. Not hurried. Ran. I charged across the sand as fast as I could manage, while carrying a ridiculous amount of gear. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hill leading away from the river suddenly seemed much steeper than I remembered. Bushes snagged at my clothes as I climbed. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, yet none of that mattered, because the entire time I felt something behind me. I never saw anything, never heard anything, but I felt it, an overwhelming sense that something terrible was right at my back, like death itself was following me up that hill. The feeling was so strong that I didn't dare look over my shoulder. I was genuinely convinced that if I stopped moving, something horrible would happen. I've experienced fear before, most people have, but this wasn't ordinary fear. This was pure survival instinct, the strongest I've ever felt. Even now, years later, I can remember exactly how it felt. I have never been that terrified before or since. Eventually, I reached the clearing near the parking area. Breathing hard, I looked up, and that's when I saw it. A massive blood moon hanging over the landscape. Its deep red color illuminated the sky in a way that felt almost unreal. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have stopped to admire it. That night, it only made everything feel more unsettling. The sight of it looming above us looked like something from a nightmare. My legs were aching. Every muscle in my body wanted to stop. I ignored all of it. I sprinted the remaining distance to the car. When I reached it, I practically threw the gear into the back. I slammed the door shut, jumped inside, and told my wife to go. The moment we started driving away, I felt a small sense of relief. Not safety, not yet. Just relief that we were finally moving away from whatever had terrified me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence inside the car felt almost as heavy as the silence back at the river. Finally, I told my wife everything. I explained the feeling, the silence, the overwhelming sense of danger, the certainty that something horrible would happen if I stayed. When I finished speaking, she looked at me with wide eyes. Then she told me something that sent chills down my spine. She had been feeling it too, not exactly the same way, but close. While she sat waiting in the car during my trips back and forth, she had become increasingly frightened. Every time I disappeared down toward the river, she became convinced I wasn't coming back. The feeling had become so intense that she started crying. She had spent much of that time praying, not because she saw anything, not because she heard anything, but because she genuinely believed something bad was about to happen. Neither of us had mentioned these feelings to each other until after we left. Yet somehow we had both experienced them. That fact still bothers me. Years have passed since that night. Neither of us has ever figured out what happened. Maybe there was a predator nearby. Maybe our subconscious minds noticed something our conscious minds didn't. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation hidden somewhere in the darkness. Or maybe there wasn't. All I know is that we never spent the night there again. The experience left such a strong impression on both of us that neither of us wanted to return after dark. Then, about 2 summers ago, something happened that brought the memory rushing back. We decided to visit the area during the daytime. Nothing more than a casual swimming trip. As we approached the entrance, we immediately noticed police vehicles and road crews setting up barricades. The entrance was being blocked. Naturally, we stopped to see what was happening. That's when we learned there had been a major incident in the area. Apparently, someone had died. and a large mess had been left behind that authorities were dealing with. The details weren't important. What mattered was the reaction between my wife and me. The moment we heard that news, we looked at each other. Neither of us needed to say anything. We were both thinking about the same night, the same silence, the same fear, the same overwhelming feeling that had driven us away years earlier. Without another word, we turned around and left. To this day, I still get chills when I think about that night at Blue Stilly Park. I've never discovered what caused the fear. I've never found an explanation for why both my wife and I felt the same sense of impending doom. And honestly, I'm not sure I want one anymore. Some experiences stay with you because of what you saw. Others stay with you because of what you felt. This one stayed with me because for a brief moment, deep in the darkness beside a river, every instinct in my body became convinced that if I didn't leave immediately, I was never coming home. And that feeling is something I will never forget.